the Sustainability Management Master's Program, you're answering one simple question. Do you care about your future generation? If you care about your kids, their grandkids, then you care about sustainability. And a sustainability manager is someone who has the tools to make people understand how they can contribute towards developing a sustainable world. We have both part-time and full-time students. Our curriculum is 30 hours. Instead of thesis, we have a research project course and a seminar course which provides them with the kind of research background they will need to be successful in their job. But at the same time, sustainability is not always everything about environment. It also relates to the business. They will take a sustainable business strategies course. They will take a project management course. Most of these courses are going to be taught by industry people, the people who are doing sustainability on a daily basis as a part of their job. Any organization that has a large number of employees and has a physical infrastructure, they will have to have a sustainability office. If you have the passion to develop and maintain a sustainable world, come to us and we will help you shape your passion into a career which will create an impact.
The Stevens Institute of Technology is proud to present the Hugo New and Geocentric Consultants Hugo New Corporation Sustainability Seminar Series, co-sponsored by Brown and Caldwell, H2M Architect and Engineers, BEM Systems, Catalyst Group, and WSP.
Today I'm going to be using the phrase water stewardship and resilience, and I think it's an important thing to just kind of define at the front end of the conversation, and that is water stewardship is the engagement that we have with the water resources in our community and planning and executing on commitments around those water resources. And then also for the long term, that's why the resilient component is in there. So water stewardship is connected to environmental, social, and corporate governance. And one of the things that we're going to talk about is I'll probably lay this out in a couple of different places, but there's a private sector pathway and a public sector pathway, and they converge in certain locations. But it's important to understand the driver from the private sector side, and I'll spend a little bit of time here talking about what that is. So for those, I'm pretty sure everybody on this call knows what environmental, social, and corporate governance is. But just a quick overview, in 2004, the UN Global Compact Initiative tried to figure out ways to integrate ESG into capital markets. And in 2009, the CEO water mandate basically began. A lot of Fortune 500 companies signed on to that, and that was a commitment to start having a water impact at the communities at which we operate. In 2013 and 14, the first studies were published showing correlation between good corporate sustainability performance and good financial results, and we'll get into a lot more detail on what that looks like. And then the biggest trigger on the space right now was a 2020 publication called Measuring Stakeholder Capital Toward Common Metrics. This is a white paper put out at the World Economic Forum. So CEOs, because of this pressure and the movement in the space, are starting to make environmental, social, and corporate governance commitments. In 2011, just 20% of the S&P 500 index companies reported on sustainability, and now 85% do. And it's important here is we'll kind of go over the history of these commitments, but when we talk about the environmental side of that commitment, we're talking about carbon, energy, water, or waste. And most of the conversation that we'll be talking about today is focused on the water side. So why are these CEOs making these commitments? Well, obviously, we're starting to see local climate impacts. We're starting to see climate change impact water scarcity. We're starting to see climate impacts on infrastructure resilience and business risk as far as long-term business risk in environments where water scarcity is an issue. And we're also seeing a lot of emphasis put into the carbon, water, energy nexus. The second part about it is there's become a pretty big drive in the last 2 to 3 years from the financial community saying that companies that set ESG commitments have a longer medium to long-term value to investors. You add on what we saw, which was some validations of the model and that valuation in COVID. And then the conversation and movement integrating sustainability reporting with financial reporting for companies and organizations. So in 2020 at the Davos climate meeting, what they did was they talked about the stakeholder capitalism, and they had 120 of the world's largest companies come and talk about defining a metric system for stakeholder capitalism. And stakeholder capitalism is defined here in the blue, and I'll just read this real quick. But stakeholder capitalism is a form of capitalism in which companies do not optimize short-term profits for shareholders, but seek long-term value creation by taking into account the needs of all of their stakeholders and society at large. So when you get all these companies to buy into this concept of stakeholder capitalism, what the other thing that they did was they started to get the major frameworks out there, Carbon Disclosure Project, SASB, GRI, to align on some key metrics that they're going to report on. And so what this did was it basically made, it started to create the framework to allow sustainability reporting to connect with financial reporting. And then the first mover in the space, the first big mover in the space was BlackRock. The world's largest asset manager put out a commitment to ESG, to companies that are working in the ESG space to start developing sustainability programs as part of their investment portfolio. And they put a lot of pressure on companies to make big strides in this space. And then the COVID-19 situation happened, which was a really interesting scenario in the workplace. What ended up happening was employees started to understand their value proposition in the company. And you saw employees stay at companies that had better ESG commitments and pathways for making those commitments. So it created a more empowered workforce. And so we saw a lot of studies over the last 2 years kind of supporting this long-term objective that had been identified a couple of years ago, that companies that set ESG commitments tend to have a better medium to long-term value in the market. So the space has been changing a lot. Global sustainability investment now tops 30 trillion, up 68% from 2014 and an order of magnitude from 2004. A strong ESG proposition can safeguard a company's long-term success. So this kind of gets into that component where employees tend to stay at companies that have good ESG programs and have strong commitments, and it makes for a company that has more lasting value in the space for a longer period of time. The magnitude of investment flow suggests that ESG is more than a fad or a feel-good exercise. And there's been over 2,000 studies on the impact of ESG propositions on equity returns. And the interesting part here is 68% of those demonstrate a positive response to ESG. Only 8% of those studies show a negative finding for a negative impact on developing and implementing an ESG program. And the reason these things are all important is because in your ESG program, you're going to have an environmental component and there's a water commitment in there. And so what we've seen is we've seen a lot of different water commitments out there. And so they range from qualitative in nature to reducing my water footprint by 10 or 15%, to a water positive commitment, to community level commitments. But everybody seems to be, not everybody, but there's a lot of movement in the space around the water side of these commitments. And so here's a bunch of examples of some of those commitments that are sitting out there right now. And what we've seen is since 2012, there's an organization called SustainServe that tracks these water stewardship commitments. And they noticed in 2012 that a large portion of those commitments were qualitative in nature. some of them were quantitative, meaning they demonstrated a 1 to 50% reduction. And those are the small quantitative kind of like stepping stone type commitments. And then some of them were quantitative and very few were net neutral or positive. And today, you're seeing still quite a bit of qualitative commitments, a pretty large reduction in quantitative commitments, an increase in quantitative commitments, and then you've seen an exponential growth in net neutral or positive level commitments. And so when we talk about that, we're talking about water positive commitments or water neutral commitments, and the quantitative commitments are pretty descriptive. But there's some pretty interesting stuff that is part of this data set, but it tells us that a lot of the companies set interim goals, met those interim goals, and then probably reset goals to be more aggressive in the space. And it's also showing how bold and innovative the space is when you start to get to net neutral or positive, because a lot of companies out there, how do you execute on net neutral or positive is a really good question. And we'll talk through how you can do that. And specifically, I'm going to talk through basically the 3 pillars on tackling water stewardship and ESG. Water stewardship is setting the commitment, defining what that commitment is for your organization. And then watershed connections and facility optimizations are 2 methods for executing that commitment. We'll go into detail on each one of these 3. So water stewardship, what is the commitment? So it kind of depends on where companies are. Organizations and companies tend to set these in different ways. In some organizations, you're seeing CEOs set water stewardship commitments because their competitors are doing the same thing. In other situations, they're doing it because they've already taken an inventory of what their water footprint is, and they want to have an impact in that space, and they understand the value of a water commitment. And in some situations, people are just copying other ones that are out there. And so understanding what your commitment is, whether your commitment is a water stewardship commitment, which to me, as I define in here, is a commitment to reduce your water footprint. A water neutral commitment is to have a net zero impact on the water resource. And a water positive commitment is to replace more than the amount of water that you use in that watershed. So that's the first step, is understanding what that commitment is. The second step is understanding what your water story is. So as an organization, if you don't have water use as a big part of your operations, you might not want to set a water positive commitment, because the value of setting that commitment and executing on that commitment is not important to your brand. So understanding your brand and how it relates to water is really important. The second part is understanding your operations and your operational flexibilities to be able to execute on whatever that commitment is. Understanding the value of water in your story and how that resonates with your clients. And then really, how do you want to be seen in this space? Do you want to be seen as innovative? Do you want to be seen as prudent? All of these are questions that go into setting a water commitment and executing on it. And then ultimately, one of the things that's now becoming an important part of this is, in the early days of the qualitative commitments, what you saw a commitment, and then some sort of narrative around what you're going to do to improve the water availability or water resources in your watershed. But now what we're seeing is something a little bit different, where you're seeing a commitment and a date. So you're seeing water neutral by 2030 or water positive by 2025. When you have that commitment and the date, you actually have a financial commitment from the organization to execute on whatever that is. And so now what we're seeing is a lot more companies trying to figure out how are they going to execute on a commitment like that. And so the key parts to executing on a commitment like that is identifying projects that will ultimately fill a pipeline of projects that you can prioritize and select. You can actually budget near term, medium term, and long term to make sure that you're going to execute on that objective. You can define risk, both with the investments, but also to your operations from a changed water resource condition. And then you're always going to want to be tracking progress to goal. One of the things that's really interesting here is when you set a 2025 or 2030 or whatever commitment out there, corporations run year to year on the way that they provide benefits to their employees. And so if you do a program and you want to spend $5 million on water stewardship, the way you get that 5 million is you show that return on investment within a year or 2 years. Well, what's interesting about this space is you're not going to see that return on investment for a couple of years. So you're going to have to be able to get creative on how you demonstrate progress to goal so that you remove the pressures of return on investment, ultimately resulting in what I would call transformative investment at the watershed level rather than transactional investment at the watershed level. And so this is some of the stuff that the space is looking at right now and really trying to figure out and understand how to respond to. So the first part is we talked about water stewardship. So how do you optimize water use within a facility? And so each organization can take, I would say you take a stepped approach to how you're going to execute on your water commitment. And the first one is, what's your water balance? And how can I have an impact by increasing water optimization at my facility or inside the fence? And so I'll walk through a couple of basic steps that you can do to kind of get that started so you can develop a pipeline of projects that show that you're actually going to meet that objective. So it probably starts with a desktop evaluation. And a desktop evaluation allows you to do a basic water mass balance of water use at your facility. And when you understand that water mass balance, you start to understand the political environment in and around your facility. You understand the water scarcity drivers. You start to understand how water is managed within the watershed and how you as an organization intersect with that. You can get a pretty good idea of opportunities for optimization. Once you get a good idea of what those opportunities are, then you're going to want to do a feasibility analysis on those opportunities, because oftentimes what you'll do is you'll have a list of projects that may demonstrate water optimization within your facility. And you're going to want to figure out the ones that may or may not be a best fit for you or realistic for your facility or operations. So doing a feasibility analysis that allows you to compare and evaluate multiple opportunities, getting a more fine-tuned understanding of that water mass balance and places where you can basically turn the dial in order to meet whatever that objective is. And this feasibility analysis gives you a better information or data set to move forward into project selection and execution. So the next phase after feasibility analysis is obviously the project development. This is project design. This is, putting a cost estimate together, identifying and mitigating risk, defining very clear what the return on investment is going to be, and then putting together that schedule. So the schedule part of this whole thing is a really interesting component. If you have a 2025 goal and you start filling your pipeline with projects and opportunities within your fence to meet that 2025 goal, and you say, oh, cool, these projects are going to happen in 2024. There's a realization point that happens when you start to invest in these projects and develop these projects where the schedule and your objective don't meet. So you can budget and fund a project that happens in 2024, but you may not be able to see the optimization benefits until 2026. So you have to actually think about that lag between investment and realization as part of your planning component. So capturing those important data points when you're identifying projects and selecting projects is critical. And then ultimately implementing the projects, understanding critical pathways, understanding what you're going to need to do to be able to demonstrate that you're meeting these objectives, and then executing the project through execution. So that's how you tackle the inside your fence. So let's say I decided to make a water neutral commitment for a facility in a specific watershed. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to optimize water use within inside the facility. That way I'm going to have a smaller footprint that allows me, when I go outside the fence to find offset programs and projects, I'm offsetting less of a water footprint. So it's kind of a two-phased approach. So when we talk about the watershed connections, these are the opportunities that are usually outside the fence of a facility where they're engaging at the community level and engaging within the watershed to have a larger watershed level impact. And most of these types of connections are in the water neutral, water positive space. You're not seeing a lot of these types of connections in the water stewardship, water optimization space. So what I've got here is I've got a couple of different connections where you can start to identify projects outside the fence, where you can work in the community to start to increase water availability by aligning objectives. And so there's opportunities with municipalities and agencies through their community water plans. And some of these plans will have really cool capital projects where they're going to replenish water in the watershed that would otherwise be lost to the watershed. That will support a water replenishment objective. Some of them will focus on resilience. Some of them will focus on reuse. These are some important kind of phrases that are going on within municipalities that allow our private sector clients to engage at the right level at the municipality side of things. And I'll kind of walk you guys through a case study here next after this. So the second one is agricultural water management. This is where you start to actually engage at the supply chain side of things. A lot of organizations right now are looking to agricultural water management because the average agricultural practice uses 40 times the water that a normal industrial facility does. It's a massive difference between the amount of water use at an ag community than it is at an industrial facility. So it's a great area of opportunity for efficiency from a water perspective. And oftentimes what you're doing is you're doing minor changes to practices, or in some situations, there's conservation easements where basically you're purchasing the fallowing of a field so that the water could be used for other beneficial uses deeper in the watershed. But most of these are water efficiency type practices where you're helping the agricultural community identify better water management practices so that they're using water resources more effectively. And then you've got like the source protection and landscape solutions. These are wetland type projects. These are stream restoration projects. These are riparian projects. These are projects where you engage. Most of these projects are identified by NGOs. So like the Nature Conservancy or Arbor Day Foundation will go out and they'll do a large replanting of a burned area. And then there's a water replenishment benefit of that reforestation project, assuming that the way that water management in the watershed actually allows for the capture of that water and the reuse of that watershed. So there's a lot of really, these are really innovative, I don't know what else you would call them, but they're innovative, they're environmental and ecosystem driven. So they're going to have an ecosystem benefit. They're not just going to have a water replenishment benefit. But usually in this space, what you're talking about is a low cost, high replenishment volume benefit. But your overall volumes are usually a little lower than they would be in a municipal type partnership. Groundwater protection with aquifer storage and recovery. So that's another water management tactic that is being explored in a lot of different communities where aquifer storage and recovery projects are retaining water within the watershed for beneficial use time or date. This increases water availability and decreases the stress put on the water resource by the industrial community or the municipality. And then there's always collaborative solutions through industrial water reuse. So in this situation, we're talking about opportunities where the effluent from a wastewater stream actually has a water quality value that allows for reuse by another either industry or municipality, or even maybe an agricultural land application opportunity. So I'm going to walk you through this kind of interesting project that I think is worth kind of demonstrating what's going on in this space and how you can execute on a water positive or water neutral commitment. So the two stakeholders here is the Water Replenishment District of LA, Southern California, and Pepsi. And what they did was Pepsi's got a water, I think it's a water neutral commitment where they have to replenish all the water that they use in a watershed in water scarce environments by 2025. And the Water Replenishment District has an objective of water independence by 2040. And so if you look at this, what you have is you have alignment between the two organizations. In the LA area, specifically, most of the water comes from the California aqueduct, which has a lot of water stresses on it. And the idea for the WRD is to become independent of that water aqueduct. And so an ASR project allows them to take high quality wastewater effluent and recharge it into the aquifer for use at a later time. And so with this project, they were looking to find a partner that would help fund the project so they could do the hydrologic analysis on the impacts to the aquifer, on the impacts to the volume that it could take and the volume that they could pull out at the other end. And they wanted to study the impacts of potential increased mobility of, let's say, some sort of constituent of concern that's found in the groundwater there. So they have to study it for a couple of years before it becomes a viable option. And so what they did was they created a partnership with Pepsi where Pepsi granted them money to upgrade the facility and do this 2-year project. And the 2-year project provides Pepsi with replenishment volume that they can take credit for towards their 100% of water used at high water risk sites by 2030. And it allowed WRD to demonstrate that they were able to meet their water independence objective. And so with this type of agreement, this is an innovative agreement. A lot of in the space historically, what's happened is you'll set a qualitative goal, and then an organization will look to a nonprofit or an NGO organization to identify projects that are more on that green infrastructure or source watershed type solutions that we talked about earlier. And that's been basically the way these projects have been solved. But ultimately, if we want to get to transformative projects in the space, if we want to get to catalytic investment that actually has a positive impact on the watershed or the ecosystem, we have to actually go to a mixture of green infrastructure and gray infrastructure. And I think this project starts to identify that, because if you increase water availability to the water users, then ultimately you're increasing water availability throughout the water ecosystem.